What is up, guys? I am Hypertrophy Coach Joe Bennett, and today I'm going to answer the question about hanging leg raises. Are they good for abs? So if you guys don't know, I do Q&As from time to time, so this is an actual question from a Q&A that's going to get its own video. And so I think that's how I'm going to do it from now on. So you have a question that maybe you'd like to see its own super cool video like this, then get them down in the comments down below, and maybe you will get your very own video. Wouldn't that be special? You're special, just like your mom said. She didn't lie. She was right. So what am I going to cover in this video? Again, I'm going to answer that question, hopefully, but we have to go through a couple points first because nothing's too easy with a Joe Bennett Hypertrophy Coach video. So first we have to establish what the abs do. If I want to know if they're good for abs, then we have to establish what do the abs do and what the heck is good for them. What does that mean? But it was a question, so I'm going to answer it. Number 3, I think there's confusion around this because there's some conflict between 3 and 4. You know, what do the nerds say about the hanging leg raises? And I'll kind of just answer some of these as I go along. The nerds say it's not an ab exercise, it's a hip flexor exercise. But the meatheads say, I feel my abs. Look at my glorious abs. They're an ab exercise. So let's provide some clarity. So how am I going to provide clarity? I'm going to do a little bit of a mechanics breakdown. If you don't know, I draw pictures and people like it when I draw pictures. At least my mom does. And so the whole point of this is, again, at the end of the day, all exercise, all training is this force applied to the body. So I'm going to show you kind of irrefutable facts, if there is such a thing, about here's the direction of force, here's where it gets your body, here's the motions, here's things happening, and basically give you a little bit of my professional opinion, but let you make some decisions all by yourself. Isn't that weird? It's like the opposite of TikTok. And so from there, we're going to go into number 6. Are they worth incorporating? So this is a little bit of kind of my, looking at what most people consider when they're trying to choose, is this good, is this bad? And kind of all encompassing within your program. Should you put these in? What are the considerations? And is there a more optimal? Because again, everybody's concerned about optimal these days. So if there is a more optimal or better exercise that maybe if it's not even a one or the other thing, maybe you want to prioritize, let's discuss that as well too. Getting right into it. So are they good for abs? Well, first off, we got to treat abs the same as every other muscle. And let's assume, like normal people, that they respond the same as every other muscle. So what is good for hypertrophy? I'm going to give you a second to answer all by yourself. Quick DM your favorite TikToker. Ask for permission to have a thought of your own and get the right answer. But how do we train any muscle group? As well, one, we need to obviously have progressive overload occurring. We need to train close proximity to failure. We have to understand the function of that muscle. What type of training tends to work the best for a muscle? Does things that where it's traditional kind of concentric, eccentric type motions where things are moving versus isometrics, and all that kind of stuff is important. So I've got a picture over here. This is as good and simple as a picture as I could find. So what do the abs do? So one, I'm not going to get into rep ranges, loading parameters, progressive overload, proximity to failure, all that kind of stuff. I'm going to give you a secret. It's the same as everything else. So if you feel like you have to do 1,000 crunches every morning because that's the way the dad did it, sorry, you don't have to. You train it normal like every other muscle. But what does it do from a function standpoint? Well, first off, everybody says, well, it pulls these things together. And that's not entirely correct. What muscles do is they create tension between an origin and an insertion. And what does that tension do? Well, it depends. So one, it can create tension, it actually creates motion. So it pulls these 2 points together. So again, where do the rectus abdominis, if we're talking about abs, yes, there's some more core stuff if you're fancy, but the reality is we're talking six-pack muscle for most people. And where are they attached? They basically attach on the ribs and to the pelvis. And again, if they create motion, they can pull those 2 points together. So it could be pelvis coming closer to the ribs, that would be kind of the reverse crunch type thing, or it could be coming ribs closer to pelvis, or kind of a combination of both. What's the other thing that they can do? They could also resist motion. So again, if I'm just saying, hey, you hold all this stuff still, and I provide resistance that makes stuff want to move, that's also them creating tension from origin to insertion. So again, to train something or for it to produce force in response to outside force, it doesn't always have to create motion. So I say all that hopefully we can visualize what I'm talking about, these 2 points together. I'll just draw one picture real quick since everybody likes my pictures. Let's say that's a pelvis. Let's say that's a rib cage. And again, we have the abs kind of going along here. If these contract, so we could have this type of motion where ribs come closer to pelvis, that would be kind of a crunch. Or do we want to, let's just clear it all off. Or we could have this type of thing happen where we have, where we have ribs and we have pelvis, and these are the abs, they contract, and what could they possibly do? They do this reverse crunch type motion, where they pull that up there. So again, both of those motions, hopefully you can see from my glorious drawing, they're pulling those 2 points together, or they can resist it. So what do the nerds say about hanging leg raises? So if we look purely from a motion standpoint, and I'm going to draw on this guy for right now, we can obviously see this is the femur sticking in the side of the pelvis. Do we see the rectus abdominis attaching anywhere to the femur? No. So if the femur moves from here, I'm going to outline it just so you can all see it well. If the femur moves from here to here, the nerds will say, well, the abs didn't do anything because they didn't create that motion. What creates that motion? What creates that hip flexion? Again, when we're talking about the hip joint, again, the abs can't actually influence the hip joint. They can't actually move the femur in there. Well, what does that? The hip flexors do, yes. And there's a couple muscles that are hip flexors that can pull the femur up if the pelvis is staying still. So if we're looking first and foremost at, let's just call it leg straight, because we'll address leg straight versus bent in a minute. But if we're looking at leg straight with the pelvis and spine fixed, so that's kind of what I've drawn here, is let's say hypothetically absolutely none of this moves, it's locked in stone, then the nerds have a point that the concentric motion occurring is being produced by hip flexors. But what is the thing that the nerds tend to neglect a little bit? Now, again, what else do abs do? Imagine that your pelvis is a bowl, and we take a bowl that's perfectly balanced, and now you're holding this bowl. I say, hey, your job is to hold this bowl. Don't let it tip this way. And now I attach something to the bowl out that way that weighs a lot. If you're holding a bowl like this with some basic physics, you should understand that that heavy thing out in front of the bowl that's attached to the bowl makes the bowl want to tilt like this. So when legs go from directly below you to right out in front of you, your entire pelvis wants to go this direction. So if your spine stays perfectly still, so if your pelvis stays still because your spine is staying still, the only way that can stay still is if your rectus and abdominis are resisting that increase of load as it goes from here to here, because that's a whole moment arm thing to the joint axis we don't have to get into, which actually is a moment arm to actually where the pelvis wants to move from the axis that's created around all the vertebra. But the whole point is if this stays still, these have to produce increasingly more and more force as your legs get higher and higher and higher. So yes, concentrically, the hip flexors are doing more work, but the abs also do a tremendous amount of work just keeping your pelvis from tipping forward. Now, if while your legs raise up, you completely relax your rectus abdominis and you allow yourself, so what happens if your pelvis tilts this way? If I go into this anterior tilt, you could see one, it looks good for the gram, so it has my butt stick out. But what else happens? I go into spinal extension. So as my legs raise up, I don't do anything with my, with my abs and just let the pelvis tilt, then that's the opposite of what the abs do. My abs are lengthening eccentrically. At best, they're resisting maybe a teeny bit of an eccentric, but they're doing the opposite of what they would do if they were producing enough force to keep it still. So the nerds have it right to a degree, whereas if you raise your legs up, you create no force with your abs, and you let your pelvis tilt into an anterior pelvic tilt, then it's pretty much almost not an ab exercise at all. If you keep your pelvis and spine perfectly still as your legs raise up, your abs are doing a pretty significant amount of work isometrically, keeping all that still, resisting the additional load that's coming from the legs itself. Now let's say that you do the legs straight, your legs come up, but you do it actually keeping your hips fixed, and you actually let your spine and pelvis move. So this would look something where it's going to be a very gradual tilt, where if we say, okay, I'm just going to establish this right here. Here's the shape of the bowl. So let's say we actually don't create any motion here. So we call this, let's say it's full hip extension. So this is where your femur doesn't move in your pelvis at all, and we just tip the whole bowl backwards, basically. It would be that posterior pelvic tilt, the thing that no female or male will ever do on the gram when they're demonstrating a glute exercise, because it makes it look bad. So what happens if we keep all of this fixed and we tilt that bowl? Well, if we tilt the bowl like this, so imagine, again, I'm not going to do the motion here, but now we have the bowl tilted this way, the pelvis this way, and we're still at hip flexion. We're still at full hip extension. So if we actually looked at the angle comparing these two, again, of how much range of motion was there here and how much was there here, there was none. So even though the leg moved in space, the leg actually only moved because the pelvis moved. And what would have to happen for this? Let me clear all that mess out of there one more time, just so hopefully we get this clear. So the pelvis tilted however many degrees. The only way this could tilt up like this is we see obviously the bottom of the pelvis was here, now it's up here. So the abs shortened significantly. So the only way, again, even if your legs stay straight but they don't move, you just have this isolated pelvic tilt, this isolated posterior pelvic tilt that's bringing those 2 points together. That motion is created 100% from abs. So all that motion, the pelvis moving in and in turn the legs moving, actually comes just from a concentric contraction from the hips. So what would you say that is? If your goal was, because we know that muscles tend to grow the best from concentric eccentric contractions as opposed to isometrics, What would be the best way to do leg raises? Well, the best way to do leg raises would be just to have that pelvic tilting. Why don't most people do it that way? One, it's really freaking hard, and two, it looks like less motion because people always don't think origin insertion when they think muscle. They just look at the stuff that moves the most. So if you do it with it's just hip flexing a lot, you can say, hey, my feet went from here to here. They traveled over this idea of they traveled 90 degrees. They moved 3 feet in space. Where if you do it this way, they might only go through maybe 20 degrees range of motion. Maybe they only moved a foot in space. But if your goal was to get the most out of hanging leg raises for abs, keep the femur still in the pelvis and just tip that pelvis. Now again, what do most people do? They do a little bit of both. So I said, what happens if you do both motions? Well, then you're just gonna have kind of a little bit of both going on. So yes, if you're coming up, and all this is assuming the motion's controlled and not just this swinging type thing. If you have some pelvic tilting under and you have some hip flexion going, then you're concentrically training both the rectus abdominis and some of your hip flexors. And so again, all of that stuff hopefully helps you realize none of this is good or bad or right or wrong. But if you have this idea of, hey, I'm gonna train something to train it as specifically as possible, the goal of not having a little bit of everything going on might be what you're after, in which case you might wanna do it the way that I mentioned. Now, what happens if the knees are bent? So for either version, if the knees are bent, so let's go to the one where we're actually tilting the pelvis a little bit, where it's mostly abs, and we're having the femur stay in the same spot. Well, if I go my leg all the way out here, then basically you're having, to a certain degree, because it's that moment arm thing, it's the distance from the axis, which is this is going to be our spine, is much longer. Whereas, let's do the eraser, if I bend the knees, and I put the knees down this way, pretend my knees are just bending that way, and my pelvis moves the exact same, you're essentially, obviously, not quite the same math because obviously your lower leg doesn't weigh as much as your upper leg, but hopefully you get the idea. Because you're pulling all this weight closer to the axis, it's essentially gonna be lighter or easier. So even though some people feel like, again, anytime something's moving more, it's ultimately better, if you want to be able to tilt your pelvis and maybe you want to bring it up a little bit further and actually have a little bit more spinal flexion, a little bit more of a posterior pelvic tilt, but you can't do it with the leg straight, you can make it lighter by bending your knees. And the same if you actually just wanted pure hip flexion. So let's say you want to train your hip flexors with this exercise, but the straight leg is a little tougher. As you bend the knees, you're basically just decreasing the load at the joint, because load is a factor of not just the weight of your legs, but how close it is to the axis, decreasing that moment arm thing and making it easier. So for either version or the combination of both versions, as your knees bent, the motion essentially gets easier. Moving on, what do we do with all this information? Is this movement worth incorporating? So one, I always say, like, people nowadays always want to make exercises about one or the other. And my question is, the only time that question really has merit is if, when you're absolutely pressed for time, you're just the Jeff Bezos out there that has like every single second accounted for. If you spend 5 minutes working out when you could have done it in 3 minutes, that just literally cost you like $12 million of your time. Okay, if you're Jeff Bezos and you have to do one or the other, then I might say there's another more optimal exercise. We can have that discussion. For most normal human beings, it's perfectly fine to incorporate that motion and just pick what you want. It's also perfectly fine to incorporate training hip flexors. And unless your goal is to absolutely maximize hypertrophy of the rectus abdominis, it's fine to have a little both going at the same time. So really, it's not a bad exercise. If you're doing it for abs, it's a pretty good exercise. And again, if you have no one's recovery is at the absolute brink or your time's at the absolute brink, most people can incorporate this and arguably a little bit more of an optimal exercise. And the one thing you do get unique from this as opposed to a crunch, which I'm going to get into in a second, is when you have your ribs coming to your pelvis, that can pretty much be all rectus abdominis. But when you have your pelvis coming to your ribs, that kind of reverse action motion, your external obliques can actually produce some of that as well too. So with anything where you have a reverse action, which really is what a hanging leg raise is, you're gonna have a little bit more, not just rectus abdominis, but also external obliques going as well too. And again, none of this is good or bad, it's just a word. Do you want some of that or do you not want some of that? So what's my idea of more optimal? Well, one's, with the range of motion trained, what is the issue with the hanging leg raise if there is something that makes it less than optimal? So let's say I actually control my hip flexors and I don't use them and I just keep my hip flexion fixed and I just tilt my pelvis. Why isn't it probably the most optimal exercise? Well, in case you're new here, I do think it makes sense to bias most muscles through their mid to lengthen range. And when you're doing those, for the most part, even if you tip into extension, you're not really training the rectus abdominis through their mid to lengthen range. You really have to load spinal extension load the rectus abdominis again through their length and range of motion. So with a hanging ab raise, you're basically just loading maybe a team in the mid-range, but all the challenges up in the shortened position, where arguably is not the optimal place to grow muscle. You can of course still grow muscle there. So one, I would like to train the range of motion where I think they are going to be the most effective for growth, which might make another exercise more optimal. And I also want to make sure that I'm loading it there. So in case you're new here, I don't sell these, but I think and I've done a whole video on this. Trevor, we're going to link it up here somewhere. I have one on the ab mat. I have a whole video, so we're not going to get into details of that. And again, I don't sell these things, so don't ask for a specific one. They don't matter. Don't pay a lot of money for someone. If someone's charging more than 20 bucks, they're just ripping you off for no actual biomechanical reasons. They'll just write that somewhere. Biomechanically the best. And everyone's like, oh, that sounds good. I'll pay 40 bucks for that. Don't pay more than 20 bucks. You're getting ripped off. So if you see this person, one, which I just found a picture online, she's probably sitting up and actually getting some hip flexors involved, which are at least the goal. But if you imagine she's up here, she's in some degree of spinal flexion. When she lays out at the bottom and brings her body around the ab mat, obviously she can't go underground unless she's hanging off of something, which maybe you could do as well too, but you're going your spine through spinal flexion and all the way through spinal extension. So this simple mat, one, actually takes you through that length and range of motion, and then two, this is easiest at the top, meaning if we do this line of force of your torso weight to all these vertebrae, then basically at this point in time it's lighter, and when you're at the bottom and you do the line of force, especially from the top to all these vertebrae, that moment arm thing is a lot longer. And so that actually is a good profile for ab back crunches where one, not only are you training it there, it's also the heaviest as far as challenge joint torque, and it gets lighter where you tend to be weaker and where it's also less effective to train. So if I was gonna say something, again, if you're gonna want something slightly more optimal, and also these are just great because you don't need fancy, expensive equipment, you don't even need to go to a gym, I recommend that as kind of my place to start. But I've had plenty of time with myself and other people where I've absolutely included both. And then you can just choose what type of form do you want to do for hanging leg raises as well too. And so to recap, do they train the abs? Pretty much almost no way around them. They do train the abs unless you're literally relaxing them on the way down. The optimal way to train abs is if you keep the hip fixed and actually just tilt the pelvis and bend and move the spine. But obviously there's a couple different variations where none of them are right or wrong. Just know which one trains more hip flexors, which one trains more abs, and which ones train a little bit of both, and choose and program appropriately. But if you want a little bit more of an optimal option, maybe program this as well. Maybe program it first, and then ultimately you could definitely program both or have one on each different day. There's really no right or wrong with that. So hopefully that helped you figure out some stuff with hanging leg raises. They absolutely do train the abs. They absolutely do train some other stuff. And I absolutely think most normal human beings can incorporate them in their programming, and it'll get some good effect for your abs without, tipping you into some horrible place where you're unable to recover. Like I said before, if you like this type of stuff and you have a question that maybe you want your own super special video, get down in the comment section below, leave me some questions, and maybe I'll make you your own special video. After watching my content, have you ever thought to yourself, man, I like how Joe went to school for this, has more formal education than 99% of other coaches, with over 20 years and 20,000 hours experience training clients in person, how he's managed training departments for several companies and helped develop literally thousands of trainers, as well as the fact that he's won 2 overall bodybuilding titles, competed at the national level, and has trained everyone from clients in their 90s all the way up to Mr. and Miss Olympia. And then you're all like, dang, I wish I had Joe's brain, and not in a creepy way, like in a jar on your mantle, but maybe just in your pocket to reference, maybe occasionally gently stroke and pet, and to help guide your gains when in the gym. Well, my friend, you are in luck. My app is essentially just that, my hypertrophy brain right in your pocket at your fingertips, packed with over 25 full programs tailored to every level and goal, the ability to create your own programs, logbook and track your progress, and a diet builder that generates and adjusts custom macros, as well as allows you to track your food and meals. It also has hundreds of hours of educational content and one-on-one support in the forums where you can get custom audio replies from myself and my coaches, and literally so much more. Best of all, you can try all it has to offer risk-free for 7 days. Click the link in the description down below and let the brain and physique gains begin.